I'm really thankful for those last two talks. So I am also an empiricist. So Elizabeth, thank you. Abdel, uh, for having. I'm thankful for the empiricism talk and also for a work in progress talk. So thank you. Yeah. So I'm at the University of Chicago. I work with Cody McCoy. I'm a postdoc there, and I'm interested in the evolution of life histories. And I mostly think about these problems across species. So when we're thinking about levels of organization, I'm working at the species level. That's my replicate. And the life history problem that I'm interested in now is in pregnancy. And so I really think that there's a lot to be learned from leveraging the 6,500 species of mammals to try to understand how pregnancy has evolved and also how conflicts can lead to sort of variation in reproductive strategies in mammals. And so the work that I'm doing now, the theoretical foundation is in maternal fetal conflict. And so there were some really nice tutorials about this yesterday. And the idea there, just to remind folks, is that although mother and fetus share a single body, they don't have identical sets of genes. And so therefore, they do not have identical genetic interests. So this results in what I like to think of as a sort of tug of war over maternal physiology. And a good example of this is something like preeclampsia, where the fetus is trying to divert resources towards itself so that it can be, I guess, a fitter offspring at the detriment to the mother. And the only cure for preeclampsia is to give birth. And so that's why women that are preeclamptic typically induce labor. That's one of the options there. And so I view sort of these problems in pregnancy. I guess the central question that I'm thinking about is, well, I'll start with the stats. And I'm thinking about these problems, I'll view it or frame it from the human perspective. So globally, 800 women die every day from pregnancy or pregnancy-related causes, and 20% of all pregnancies involve some type of complication. They involve some sort of complication. So these are typically vascular and metabolic. So things like preeclampsia, like I mentioned, gestational diabetes, and also hemorrhage due to things like invasive placentation. And so I guess one of the things when I was first introduced to sort of this project, and I never really thought about problems in mammals in general. But one of the questions that sort of arose there, and maybe it's kind of intuitive, is like, why is pregnancy so risky? And I think within that single question, there's two sort of sub-questions. So first of all, is it so risky? So those stats that I just gave you for humans, how do those compare to other species that also get pregnant? We have a poor understanding of that. And the second question is, so why is pregnancy so risky? It's the why. So what are the potential drivers of these complications that arise during pregnancy? And maternal fetal conflict actually lays a really nice foundation for understanding both of those questions. And so I'm sort of think about these pregnancy complications as complications to the mother and complications to the offspring. That's just sort of how I'm going to frame this talk here, but I understand that they're not mutually exclusive. Like something bad happens to the mother that will indirectly affect the offspring as well, but it's just how I'm going to lay these out. And so the stats that I told about pregnancy complications in humans, those aren't uniquely human problems. And so, for example, in spotted hyenas, we heard about them earlier. It's incredible. What are the odds? So they also have really complicated births. They also have very complicated birth canals. I don't know if that's a thing that people can look into. Also, meerkats, highly social, have very complicated births as well. And chimpanzees, so arguably one of our closest relatives, they have complicated pregnancies. So you may be thinking, okay, George, like this is pretty grim. Like just every mammal just have complicated pregnancies like humans, not giraffes. So giraffes, they have relatively low rates of preeclampsia. This could be due to the fact that they already have very high blood pressure. They need to move blood around. And so these are, kind of cool little anecdotes and species specific examples, and you could argue, okay, cool. If you compare a human to any other species, odds are they're going to be different. But what I'm arguing is we can, sort of leverage this diversity of mammals to try to understand what's going on in humans. And so now I want to talk about the why. So for maternal complications, sort of the maybe traditional biomedical view, or maybe, there's one potential explanation is this obstetric dilemma, right? So humans evolved bipedalism, and we also have really big brains. And so the complications that arise during pregnancy might be due to fetal obstruction. It's a reasonable prediction. The data don't support that at all. So chimpanzees have similar fetal pelvic geometry, and they have far lower rates of fetal obstruction during labor. And there was a paper that just came out recently this year that showed the title is Humans Are Not Unique. It was looking specifically at that, so fetal obstruction. And they found that if you look at humans, sort of populations of pre-industrial humans, so the closest thing you could get to a natural human comparable to other animals in nature, we just have similar rates of mortality, maternal mortality due to fetal obstruction. So there is another sort of prediction that maternal fetal conflict offers, and has to do with how humans evolved in terms of our sociality. And so this is the idea of alloparenting. And this is one of the cooler things about this project. I've been able to collaborate with David Haig, and if you've read his stuff or you've spoken to him, you know that he's lovely, but also he has some verbal arguments that are super compelling. And so this is one of those. This was just like in a discussion paragraph of some current biology paper, and that's sort of the basis of what I'm testing here. So the hypothesis there is that humans, we're social species. We also have a high degree of alloparenting. And so what I mean by alloparenting is we have care for offspring from the mothers and also others. So babies born, family members can help out. There are many other species where the mother is the sole carer. And so the idea here, if maternal fetal conflict, if you think about it through this lens, if the fetus is selected to extract more resources from the mother than the mother is selected to provide, in species with alloparenting, we would predict that the fetus would be selected to extract even more resources. So to an extent, relative to species where the mother is the sole carer. So that is something that I'm interested in testing. Sort of this sociality versus rates of maternal complications. And so now I just want to show you some of the data that I've collected so far. So this is kind of how this will work. I'll talk about the stats, or what is known, the hypothesis, and then I'll show you what I've done so far. And so here I've just sort of extracted data from that study that shows that fetal obstruction, the rates of fetal obstruction in humans is not unique, and it's actually relatively low compared to some other mammals when we look across the tree of life. So this is the type of data, or these are the type of data that I'm aiming to collect here. So not only do I want to collect, these are just data for mortality ascribed to fetal obstruction, but I want to look at other things like rates of gestational diabetes, preeclampsia, mortality from placental hemorrhage, and things like that. So this is sort of the mom side of things. And so pregnancy is risky for moms. It's also risky for offspring. And so, just, I guess, some more sort of like sobering stats. So 15% of all pregnancies will miscarry. And half of all, in humans, sorry, this is in humans, and 50% of all fertilized embryos will never implant. So they're lost before the pregnancy can even be detected. And so again, the question is, why is this so risky for offspring? And is it risky, like relative to other things? And so the prediction from maternal fetal conflict is that it has to do with the energy that mothers are allocating to offspring during development. And so, another great quote from David, and I think he pulled this from Hamlet. It was something he said that in terms of when the strongest sort of selective screening for offspring quality should occur is prior to the developmental phase where maternal energetic investment is most costly, right? So to think about this quite crudely, and I've mentioned to folks I'm still learning how to talk about these problems sensitively, but from like an economics perspective, you want to have a good return on your investment. So if you're going to invest in an offspring, it better be worth that investment, right? And so, yeah, David Higgs, both from Hamlin, he said, if it were done, 'twere best it were done quickly. And I think this is like before maybe Banquo was going to be killed or something like that. So anyway, so that's the prediction there. But when you think about mammalian life history strategies, there's variation in sort of when the highest degree of energy allocation occurs, right? So as Elizabeth mentioned earlier, hyenas, for example, have really costly, they have really lengthy gestation periods. Also, they allocate a lot of energy to lactation, so milk production. That's kind of a unique case. I think it's maybe goes a bit tangential from where I want to go, but that's kind of the thing I'm thinking about. And so for something like placental mammals, gestation length is relatively, or just the gestation period is relatively costly. So that might explain why in humans, 50% of embryos never implant. It's because that's the stage. That implantation stage is what precedes gestation. Whereas something like marsupials, lactation is super expensive. Also, marsupials are born at a very underdeveloped state, very precocial. Is that right? Is there anyone? Yeah, cool. So they spend a lot of time in the pouch, right? So the strongest selection from the mother's perspective should occur, or for offspring quality, should occur prior to lactation. Okay, so yeah, that's sort of the prediction there. Oh, I skipped over this, but here's just, I forgot the stats. So these are just cool examples of, sort of high degrees of offspring loss. So this, I guess this dovetails into the point I was just making. So this is a placental mammal. This is the Plains viscacha. I don't know if anyone's heard of this. It can ovulate up to 800 eggs, 2 of which will be born. So that is an extreme degree of offspring mortality from between ovulation and birth. And that sort of aligns with the prediction for maternal fetal conflict theory. Whereas something like the Virginia opossum can give birth. So in marsupials, offspring survival is dependent on teat attachment. So you can only have the maximum litter size that a marsupial can have is limited by the number of teats that they have. So in the Virginia opossum, gives birth to up to 20 young, but it only has 13 teats. And so you could argue that there's a selective screening that's being applied to these offspring where only the ones that can successfully race to a teat survive and the rest are lost. Okay, cool. So these are just 2 examples. And so I've been collecting some data on this. I've been looking at offspring mortality stage-specific offspring mortality in a bunch of different mammals. Here's what I found so far. So this is just here I'm just showing you the neonatal mortality. So this is after birth, so between birth and weaning for, I think it's like 70 species or something like that. And just showing you the dichotomy between marsupials and eutherians. You can notice, so these, I guess cooler colors here. These are preliminary data. I was thinking I could just talk about these patterns, but I don't know. The only ones that really jump out to me, basically, like there's lots of variation, even among closely related species. That's great for comparative analyses. But you look at stuff like these macropod marsupials. So for example, like a kangaroo, typically has a litter size of 1. So it ovulates 1 egg, and that is a pretty good chance that that offspring is going to survive from birth and through to weaning. Yeah, and then beyond that, like there's just sort of a smattering of, sort of this range of neonatal mortality. Now, this is just for one stage of development. What I'm really interested in looking at is across stages of development among species, what patterns do we see? So, so for example, like the Plains viscacha I just mentioned, loses tons of offspring between ovulation and birth. Humans also lose 50% of offspring between ovulation and implantation. What do these look like when we actually compare among species? And so here I'm just showing that. So on the y-axis, we have the proportion of offspring that are surviving, and on the x is each developmental stage. And I'll show you data for 3 species of marsupials. That's the group that I've been collecting data from the most. So that's what you're going to get. But yeah, so we had these 3 species that have, lots of different differences in their life history strategies. Litter size is a big one. But you can see that, some, like, again, this macropod, this is a wallaby. Yeah, pretty much what you ovulate is what you're going to wean. You have this bandicoot here, which has maybe more of a monotonic loss from ovulation to weaning. And I say weaning, but this is how many end up in the pouch. But here's the Virginia opossum, where again we see these just massive losses from what kind of goes into this developmental pipeline into what comes out. So yeah, trying to understand why that is. So I've collected the data for mortality across developmental stages, but I'm also really, there's so many columns in this data set because I'm trying to come up with all else being equal arguments, right? So like I want to account for developmental duration, litter size, which is really important for these, understanding these types of patterns. So body size, things like that. So yeah, I think that's kind of what I have for these patterns. And where am I at for time? Any idea? Good?
Time for questions, or you want to do more?
So I have a little bit more. So that's one of the projects I'm working on for my postdoc. The group that I'm in, we think about conflicts within cooperation. So I'm looking at problems in human pregnancy. I'm also interested in problems in, oops, I'm going to skip over this. If people want to talk about like the hormonal basis of what's going on, Carl just mentioned it a little while ago. I'm happy to talk about that. Other thing I'm working on is conflict within cooperation of photosymbiotic animals. So these are species or animals that host symbiotic algae that can photosynthesize. And as you can imagine, again, it's the same problem. We have 2 species that are existing in one body. And so there's opportunity for conflict to arise. And so what I'm doing here, I've got a couple great undergrads that I'm working with. We are trying to build the largest data set of photosymbiotic animals. So we're trying to classify host and symbiont species. Also, things like whether these species have vertical or horizontal symbiont transmission. You can imagine there are some sort of implications there for how that might affect or modulate conflict within these systems. And we're also looking at things like where exactly in the host is the symbiont housed, and how does that affect sort of the transfer of nutrients between host and symbiont. So yeah, it's just another thing that I'm working on. But yeah, I say my whole thing is just testing theories with big data sets. So if anyone's interested in chatting about that, I would love to talk more about that. Oh, and this is a bit, if I have time, I have one thing that's a bit out of pocket. Oh, crap. Exit. Oh, yeah. Another thing. So, yeah, I guess I can show this. So, yeah, my background, I've never really even thought about endotherms. I've always been kind of interested in marine invertebrates and cold-blooded things. But I'm curious if, maybe this is naive of me, but I think there are some really cool opportunities to think about these problems in other systems as well, other species. It's like basically anything I'm showing you here. These are just three examples of species that are live bearing. So we have this is a potato bug up here, has a marsupium. This is a sea star, and then we have some live bearing lizards. And I wonder if thinking about not just in live bearing things, but kind of this the opportunity for sort of conflict between mother or parents and offspring, if that kind of exists along a continuum of even, you could look within live bearing things, but also egg laying to live bearing, and then degree of parental care, subsequently. So I don't know. That's just something I've been thinking about. And again, this is where I first started when Cody and I were talking about internal conflicts. I was like, wait, what about these things that I know more about? So anyway, that's it.